Welcome to the AI for Everyone podcast. And so I have with me on the call my colleague Abhimanyu, and we have Arjun, who is a senior manager of product and engineering at Amazon, and he is with the drone team. So, there's quite a bit of an interesting conversation that we expect. We want to unpack quite a few topics, but primarily we want to try and focus and understand three different areas. One, what's Arjun's journey, what it's looked like at Amazon, what his learnings were, how he broke into this particular role. We also want to try and understand, his view on product management, how he's seen it evolve, and then of course, AI technology. There's so much of interest and there's so much of traction that's been happening around AI in the last couple of years. So we really want to try and understand his view of AI tech and how he utilizes it at work and really get his take on it. So welcome, Arjun.
Thank you.
Awesome. So, Arjun, I'd really like to try and understand, your journey uh, into Amazon and primarily, how you came upon and how you, particularly selected this sort of route into your career. Really like to try and just unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I think I do. I like to think of. I wish the story was I. I planned to get here, and I did five different things, and this is exactly how the trajectory ended up. It is quite the opposite, and it was just one stumbling decision after the next. Each one felt wrong, and then it was series of wrong decisions that ended up being right in the end. And I start off by saying that because it's hard to plan in an industry that's moving so fast. And I think let's maybe I just want to caveat that for anyone that's trying to break into this space, it's really hard to plan. But I think what I found, and we'll learn about this as I'm hopeful that I'm able to share some of that, is I think the biggest skill set that one can possess is just being able to pivot and change directions, change your mindset, change your frame of reference on different things. So I'll quickly walk you through, my journey into Amazon, which is a space I think which has been an interesting career in itself for me. Which I started off actually in academic research after my engineering. I was a researcher in a physics lab for a good period of years after I graduated. Then I did not want to continue in the academic space, and I moved into market research and worked for Course 5 for a few years. And that was really my first entry into the tech world. And obviously, got to work with a bunch of big tech back then. And I remember it was early days of Azure and early days of AWS, and there were some really exciting projects. And I think that's what really got me to start understanding what the space was about. It was early days of the industry, and everyone was figuring out. Now, obviously, there are parallels there. Again, we are there. I can it's deja vu 10 12 years later with what's happening with AI. It was early days of cloud, early days of AI. It's all coming together. I can see that. I moved to the US around 2014 to get my MBA, and I went to a school, Purdue, that was essentially it was a program that was more focused on supply chain. And Amazon happened outside of B school. And even once I got into Amazon, I wasn't thinking AI. I was just happy to be working in big tech, which obviously was a big thing in during that time. And I did not actually join as a product manager, and that's kind of the first milestone in this journey. I graduated from MBA wanting to be somebody that worked in the supply chain space, um, supply chain operations. That's what I went to school for. I specialized in that, and I joined actually as a supply chain program manager. That was really my first role. Nothing to do with AI, nothing to do with product management, but my role essentially was a sort of a planning analyst almost, and that was my day to day job in the last mile service expansion, as in so if you think about you've got your brown Amazon boxes, It's delivered today, depending on which country you live in, by a different carrier. In the US, it was predominantly FedEx and UPS and the Postal Service, and Amazon was growing faster than the capacity that the three carriers had. And so we wanted to build this last mile capability in house. And I just happened to get into that program in the early days that was being set up. And obviously, as you can imagine, the scale of something like that is pretty massive. So while I started out in that role, my job there was essentially to, and the program had just piloted one or two early projects, and my role was to figure out the expansion plan. Like, how do we go and this is pretty typical of big tech, right? Which is that we want to drive big step changes in a short period of time. A pilot works. It's not a let's do 10% this year, 20% next year. It's how do we go 90% in 2 years time. And that was my go big plan. And so I worked on the project for about 3 years. And it was quite a big scale, and essentially helped drive the expansion of our last mile service from pretty much one or two big cities like New York, Philadelphia, to pretty much we were getting into really small cities like Colorado Springs, which is almost a tier three, tier four city. And so all of that happened in a 3 year period. Um, and during the course of my time doing that, I ended up touching a lot of other partner teams. I was involved with the early days of our air cargo business, and I tell this story to a couple of other. I used to talk to new MBA hires back in the day, and I used to share this anecdote with them. 6 months into my role, and this is important more to emphasize the point about moving fast. 6 months into my role, there was an initiative within the company to stand up our own air cargo service, because again, we were paying a ton of money to all the third party carriers to ship our packages cross country. Amazon wanted to start doing it, and there was an initiative and a proposal was being put together to be reviewed with Jeff Bezos. And I had one FAQ in that document. It was probably a 5-6 line FAQ on how, once the packages enter the airport hub, how do we take it to the customer in each city? And that was the question I was answering. I worked with a research scientist. We worked on this for about 3 weeks, modeled a bunch of scenarios, showed the cost on each of this. It was a 5 line summary, dropped it into the document. I was too junior, of course, I wasn't in any of those meetings or anything. Um, but from when I wrote that FAQ, about 8 months later, I was actually flying out of Seattle to Chicago or somewhere for an event. And as the plane, I was in Delta or whatever, was taxiing, I looked to my left and I saw a 767 with the logo Prime Air emblazoned on it. And to go from here's a document, here's a proposal, to there's a cargo jet sitting on the tarmac in 8 months, that's the power of thinking big and moving fast. And so to me, that was a life changing experience. And that's sort of been a big part of make quick decisions and move fast. So that was my journey with the last mile space. And while I was working there, and I was starting to think about like what's next, I had a big part of my work was actually working with the research science team, and I'll talk about this is my point where I made my switch into product management. So a big portion of my work was trying to figure out, we get into a certain city, what's the right coverage area, what part of it, should we deliver packages by ourselves, what do we have with our partners. It was a I mean, essentially an optimization problem that looked different in different cities. So I was fascinated by the problem. I sat on that problem for 3.5 years, and I worked with our science teams, worked with our engineering teams to be able to roll out solutions that made sense. That's when I started thinking about, yes, but again, like what's next? And I felt like the business was pretty stable. It was time to move on. That's when the drone project happened. And the drone project, for folks that are not familiar, I'll give a quick introduction about the history of it and kind of why this is important. So back in 2013, I remember I was actually in course 5 at that time, when I saw this news piece that Jeff Bezos did an interview with Charlie Rose, and he walks him through how packages are going to be delivered by drone within 60 minutes. And I remember watching the clip and I was being blown away by it and thinking like, isn't that amazing? And I remember I was driving to work one day thinking about like what a step change that would be, aerial last mile within the city. And that had been an R&D project in the company, and Very few people obviously had access to what is going on, given the security nature that's involved with the project like this. But we knew sooner or later that an R&D project needs to come to fruition. It needs to come to well, not needs to come to fruition, but when it does come to fruition, it needs to become operational. I was in the team that was the operational backend, so I knew we would have these conversations sooner or later, and it happened. And I was in the role that was looking out next 2 years, 3 years, where do we go. Somebody from the other team was also thinking about how do we plug into the mothership. We had some conversations. They were trying to reduce cost, I was trying to increase capacity. It worked out really well, and we started putting together again another proposal. How do we get the two projects to meet? And then this person said, why don't you come over here and work for us instead of sitting on the last mile team and trying to figure out how we integrate with you? I thought, yeah, that makes sense. Then that's when I moved into the drone project, and I realized what a different world this was. It was in operation. It was, again, it was an R&D project. That's where I took on a product role, and I had the domain expertise, and that's my next point. I had the domain expertise in sort of the supply chain of the last mile. I understood the economics of it. I understood the science behind it. I understood the operations behind it, that I was then able to go into a product role and put on the user hat and think about, how do we design our systems here. I'll pause here, but that was essentially my ingress into that product role. And I'll talk a little bit more as we go about that role in specific, but I hope I was able to sort of establish some context around how I came into this space.
Absolutely, Arjun. That was quite detailed, and I think it really prompted one question, which is that point you made about the whole 90% in 2 years, right? How do you scale from idea to 90% in 2 years? Um, so I'm very curious in terms of what that looks like for any program. In terms of your visibility into how that idea then gets scaled, uh, from a is it a top down decisions? Do you have any visibility in terms of how resources are allocated? How does the culture enable that sort of progress? Is it everyone, or all of the folks who are, or team members who are aligned to an initiative like that? Are they all just running at 100 miles an hour? Is there, what is the method to the madness, right? Or
Yeah.
what is the method to scale, right? Really curious to try and understand that a little more.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
I think you touched upon a few of those big ones, and let me maybe give you some examples here, and maybe help on this point. It starts with, and I think this is where I think we should talk about the intersection of how product management is done at Amazon, and I think that's relevant to your question. Um, you rarely get to a 0 to 90 in a short period of time without having that vision upfront. Meaning, let's say, and to drive home this point, let me make sure I sort of give you an example. Let's say I'm a new product manager. I'm in a space that I understand pretty well, and I'm building a low code app. It's a pilot project, and I've shipped this app to maybe 10, 15 customers. I've gotten good feedback. Where do I go from there? The problem is that unless I know what the ceiling looks like, unless I've actually thought through, is the addressable market big enough? Is this a big enough problem for enough users? I'm not actually going to have a good understanding of what 90% looks like. I'm going to iterate. I'm going to focus on customer experiences. Maybe I go from 10 users to maybe 100 users. I'm going to think linearly if I start with a let me get my hands dirty approach. What I would instead do, and again, right, like this is where if you're a researcher, if you're an engineer, that's a great approach, right? Get your hands dirty, absolutely. As a product person, that's where I would expect a product person to not jump in too quickly, and really sit down and think through it. And we do this a lot at the company. I'm sure it's written about in the news, and if you're familiar with A process called the PR FAQ process is what we follow. It's the PR, the press release, stroke FAQ, frequently asked questions. Um, if you're a product manager in Amazon, if you've been in this company for more than 6 months, you've probably written a PR FAQ that's been reviewed by at least a director of the week.
Yep.
What is a PR FAQ? It is essentially a memo. It is a six-page document that the first page is essentially a press release. So it is a hypothetical press release. You're a product manager. You want to, let's say you're building a new smartwatch. The first page is a press release on the day the product is announced. Here's what the press release looks like. And there's a headline, there's a date. Business Wire said this today. Amazon announced this. Here are the key features, and then here are a couple of quotes, maybe one from a user, one from an internal leader. So if you pull up any Amazon press release, and if you run it through an AI tool, you'll see that's pretty much a very standard template. And then you have 5 pages of frequently asked questions. And we think of frequently asked questions in sort of two ways. We think of it from a customer facing FAQ, which is I'm a customer. What am I going to see in terms of here are the features? What are my pain points? How is this better than what I'm already using, or what else is out there? That's really like about a page and a half, depending on how customer facing it is. But then we spend a ton of time talking about internal FAQs. We talk about what exactly is we go into a lot of details, and I don't want to go into specific FAQs, but essentially internally we debate about like for example, we talk about one of the questions there is going to be what does the 0 to 90 plan look like, and we speak about resourcing over there, and we speak about we talk about a lot of scenario modeling. We talk about what does what would we do if this pilot turns out to be better than we expect? What do we do if this pilot turns out to be worse than we expect? Would we not pursue it further? Would we go slow? So those questions are hashed out in the very beginning. And we spend, and again, right, a PR FAQ, a document like this is not put together in a week. It takes a good part of 3 months. A good big PR FAQ takes it's usually about a 3 month body of work. It's usually at least about 10 to 15 on average stakeholders that are contributing in some way or shape. So it is a heavy lift in the sense that you like there's alignment that you drive on the vision. There's input sort, finance is involved in making sure the story comes together. You have UX teams that contribute to mocks, if that's applicable. You have science teams doing whether data science, research science teams running scenarios, walking the product person through, here's the what if scenarios. We hash out all those questions. And so when you actually go into here's my proposal, you actually know what 0 to 90, like what the pulling the trigger looks like. It's not news. And so the pilot almost becomes a step that you need to get through to get to the 0 to 90. So I hope that makes sense. You don't just stumble into a situation where you go from 0 to 90. You get in, like, at -1 what your 0 to 90 path looks like.
I guess this is interesting in the sense, it also makes me think about uh, how do you how do you avoid execution bias,
Yeah,
right? Oftentimes, I mean, there is no dearth for ideas. In companies we have, whether it's at Amazon or any other consulting organization or manufacturing setup, there are folks who are constantly, who've got great ideas, who are, companies probably have mechanisms, right, like ideathons and hackathons and so on, to surface these kinds of ideas. But oftentimes, there is, what really determines success of a program is also about how you throttle that execution bias. Do I execute too quick? Do I execute too late?
yeah,
And you really need to time it appropriately. So, what have you learned
right.
from that execution point of view? That is 3 months too much, in terms of doing the due diligence, or do you spend more time? How do you believe one arrives at that, right?
Yeah, great question.
Yeah.
Uh, Yeah, I think the first part of that, and I realized that I didn't answer something that you brought up in the beginning. Um, the execution of a broader, a larger scale initiative is, as much as I don't know, like maybe this is a cultural thing. It tends to be top down. I think like I did want to address that piece first.
Yeah,
It tends to be top down because it is resource intensive. I mean, like it's not going to just happen. So there needs to be buy-in. If you're in a large, of course, again, right? It may not be the case in startups that are that look very different. But if you're in a large company, you're thinking about moving into a product space, and it's fairly common that you need to influence people, stakeholders. I mean, at higher levels, you need to influence finance team. So it tends to be top down. I did want to maybe address that first. Now, on the execution bias side, great question. I think, in my opinion, the best way to overcome execution bias is to be very clear on the metrics. And you I would rarely, as a product person myself, or even folks on my team, I would rarely sign off even on a pilot without a notional understanding of how do we measure success. Um, and we need to be very clear about, and I think of metrics in sort of on two dimensions. And one, I think of metrics in terms of the tracking to completion of set features. How we So as an example, we think that there are 10 features that we need to knock out before we think this is going to be successful. I want to keep a close eye on do we want to obviously like get 8 of those done, pushed out, pause, build the next two. Like, I think I'd really like to understand the gating of how we build, how we release, what feedback do we get. There's a lot of execution that is controlled in sort of that early phase of the build. And so really understanding the completion criteria. What are we rolling out? How are we measuring engagement, if that's the metric, if number of downloads, whatever it is, right? Depending, and we track completely different metrics. But that's the first part, is knowing very clearly is where are we in the burn down of the feature readiness itself. The second part of it is how, and this is where, as a product manager, it's important to step into the technical space a little bit. And this is something I have a strong opinion about this, and you'll see this come through in the later part of the discussion. Is that product managers in the early stages of the product development lifecycle need to lean in heavily on understanding the business. There's just no, obviously there's no two ways about it, right? But then you need to switch your roles. And once the rubber hits the road, like on day one that we start building, we need to start thinking about the kind of the rigidity of the service that we're building. And we need to start thinking about what is our service availabilities look like. What are we offering? What kind of latencies are we talking about? Is there a caching problem that we might run into here? So we need to be in the details, thinking about what like metrics at a system level, like system level metrics. And these are all early indicators that, as your engineers start building out some of these features, and you'll start getting those metrics. And staying close to those metrics helps you prevent execution bias. If this is trending in the right direction, this is not trending, you can course correct easily. And the cost of not staying close to the metrics is what you talked about, which is that you get too far down the path, and it might be too late to reverse some of those decisions. So to me, that's how I think about overcoming execution bias. And also, it lets you pull the plug on bad decisions earlier. And I think that's the other part, that I think that's, if I'm not mistaken, it's probably where you're going with that, is um, maybe I overestimated just how effective this is. And you kind of walk down the path, and you realize, not the best idea. And we've seen that, and I've been part of some of those projects as well. And we walk back early enough. Then that's when you pivot. That's when you pivot. You go back to the drawing board. You think about, did we think about the end user correctly? Did we really? And then the product manager goes back to wearing the business hat. Did I
yeah,
really understand the
yeah.
customer pain point correctly there? Right. And I think that's it. It's such a, the early days are so focused on try something, plan something, try something. It's that, and then you harden on. Okay, I think I've landed on what works. Off to the races, 0 to 90.
What does that look like, Arjun, when it comes to the metrics per se? I think this is a pretty strong understanding there. But when it comes to a new market versus an existing market, right? A
Mm,
lot of what you described, it's par for course, right?
right,
Especially when we're talking about measuring, pivoting, and so on. But when we are talking about a net new market, and
right.
especially I imagine, with the drone delivery service, or some other new initiative, um, those there isn't an existing market yet. You're still trying to figure out whether there is some sort of a product market fit.
Hmm.
uh, there's going to be traction, right, in terms of uptake and so on. What does it look like, especially when it comes to the metrics, your experience over there?
Yeah, this is actually a good point. I think to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about sort of my current role. That I've actually been in this role for about 5 years, 5.5 years in the current space in the with the drone project. And it's in we are actually making customer deliveries today in the US in a couple of cities. So we are a very real live operational program. So I've had the chance to be have a seat at a program that you talked about, and I think that's why this is such a relevant question. Um, I've seen us being in a state we didn't have metrics, and now we have metrics. Now, obviously, like I think I'm going to not be able to talk specific metrics, but I'll tell you how we think about it. I think that might be relevant. The part that I think is important here is when you're thinking about a new space. Um, in our case, at least with the drone project, there was some precedence of we could still pull a lot of metrics from human aviation, and we're, essentially that's the first part is understanding what business are you. And the way that I came around to understanding this was I'm not in the delivery business, I'm in the aviation business. Those are two different businesses. And I thought I joined the delivery business, but then I realized, no, this is the aviation business. Why is that so important? If you're in the delivery business, you're going to be tracking like the first metric you're going to track in if you're in the delivery business is speed to the customer. You're going to think about what's the time taken, from the point of origin to the point of delivery, and you're going to constantly try to cut that down. The other metric you're going to track obviously is the cost. You're going to try to electrify your fleet. You're going to try to see if there's you're going to experiment with different labor models. You're going to try to reduce the packaging material and kind of the sort of try and ship product in their original packaging instead of all the fluff in the boxes, so you can pack more in, right? You get more volume that you can get in each delivery, and you're going to think about those metrics first. If you're in the aviation business, you're not thinking about those metrics. You're thinking about them, but they're not top. You're thinking about safety first, and it's a very different mindset. And you're thinking about safety. You're thinking about speed, absolutely, because that's the whole idea of somebody wants to get this in 30 minutes or 60 minutes. Uh, but when you think about metrics, you're thinking about safety, and that's the big difference there. Now, safety is a metric that a ground delivery business would track. You would probably be number 6 or 7 on the list. In the aviation world, you don't have a business if you're not a safely tested system. Now that in and of itself drives a lot of the design thinking of how we design hardware, how we design our communication systems with say with air traffic control. What kind of ground operations do we run? It influences everything that we do around it. And so once all of that is hardened, we can think about speed. We can think, and cost is where we want to get to, but cost is a year 6 7 discussion versus a year 1 2 discussion is safe. Does that make sense? That's kind of the broad difference in. So that's why knowing which business you're in is so essential.
This is we could spend an entire hour just diving into that, but that's really helpful to understand your perspective, Arjun. So let's switch gears a little bit, right? Let's move into an adjacent space, which is, we talked about um, AI
Yeah.
technology, right? And so I would imagine that, uh, given this is aviation business, we are talking about a very
Mhm.
consumer facing business. There are all kinds of different AI systems and AI technology that might be used. And my question is not just specific to your role or what you're specifically doing, but from your interactions with your colleagues in similar industries or your peers as well, that how are you seeing AI technology being infused into a PM role?
Yeah.
How are you seeing that evolving? So why don't we start with perhaps just talking about what your first treat with AI
Yeah.
tech was, right? And how have you seen that changing over time?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. This is the part that I'm really excited to talk about. I'm excited about the other stuff as well, but this is the part that really stretched me, and that's why I continue to remain in this space. Let's maybe go back to where we left off with, so I started product, and I do want to make this a personal story, and I know, like, that's also going to help the audience, because I've read a lot about this, and I think what, and if I'm able to relate to a lot of what I'm reading because I have had the hands-on experience. If you're somebody that's getting into the space without the hands-on experience, you're going to read this in a very academic fashion. You're not going to know, like, what exactly people are talking about in a deep way. And so that's the reason I want to share this personal sort of, journey, so to help establish the point, because I feel like there aren't enough PMs out there talking about the work that they've done, and how it all adds up. So I actually, so again, joined as a product manager to work on a completely different problem. I had zero idea. We're talking about late 2018. So, like, just for timeline context, because this has changed so fast. I mean, since the pandemic. That's when I happened to, like, totally by accident, and some of this is accident, but some of this is also deliberate accidents, and that's the other piece, is that I did not know exactly what I would be getting into, but I knew enough to establish that this was an important customer problem to solve. And that's how I got into the AI space. So at least I think that's the peripheral understanding that, I would expect that if somebody's getting into the space, they have that. Now, when we talk about AI, you don't get into AI. You use AI to solve customer problems, and I think there's a big difference between the two. If you're a research scientist, you're in AI, you're building models. That's very different. If you're a PM getting into AI, you don't really get into AI. Fundamentally, you use AI. You control inputs, you control outputs, but you're still in the business that you operate in. And I think that's kind of the first level of detachment. And we can talk a little bit more about, and Anil, you and I have talked about this in the past. I fundamentally believe that a PM's role is getting more technical in the industry as a whole, and we'll talk about how that's happening. Um, and so I started working, essentially, and again, I might frustrate you a little bit with the lack of details on this, but that's just just because I can't. But essentially, I worked with, I was involved with, let's just say that I was involved with the development of the autopilot on the drone, and that was my ingress into this world of AI. And I work closely with, the computer vision teams, and you'll see YouTube videos of, when the drone comes in to deliver packages. Essentially, if you're familiar with the Tesla's, full self driving stack, and how autonomous cars work, it's the same concept. It's the same concept from a hardware point of view, from a software point of view, from a there's some, obviously there are differences because you're now operating in a 3D space versus a 2D space. And in, most developed countries in the world, you have, for example, you have stop signs on roads, and you have, lane markings. That all of that is training data and inference data for models. And I was in a Tesla last week, and it was the first time that I was actually trying out the full self driving feature, and it switched a couple of lanes and took an exit on the freeway, and I was blown away by it. It was one thing being in the car and seeing that happen, but obviously I was familiar with how the tech works, but being in it, I think, was a pretty interesting experience. And I was involved with teams that were essentially building that for the drone. And if you there's like we've talked about this in public events, in terms of how a drone sees uh, a lot of the delivery decisions that it makes. And so at a fundamental concept, the idea is that a drone leaves a delivery depot where the packages are there, and it flies a few miles, and then it essentially comes to a person's house, could be their front yard or backyard, and then lowers down, comes to a certain height, drops a package and goes back, and that's pretty much how most drone deliveries happen. Some companies do it a little differently. Zipline, there's a company called Zipline, if you ever look it up. uh, they tend not to come all the way down. Instead, as they fly past, they drop the package and continue to fly. Some companies will hover at a certain point, use a tether and drop a package and then continue to leave. Google does that. Amazon's approach is slightly different. We actually we fly all the way down, drop a package and then fly back. So there's different design considerations on why we do things differently. But AI, essentially the AI part of it, and I was involved with the teams that were building the computer vision algorithms to make some of those decisions on when how do you avoid obstacles, how do you know when when it's safe to continue flying versus you need to abort mission. What does aborting mission look like? What do you do next? So these are the problems that we're trying to solve. So I guess my point is that it's still a customer problem that we're trying to solve, and the core scientists are the ones that are actually figuring out what are the algorithms, what does again, like, what does performance look like? Are we talking, is 96% okay in one, 99.99 needed in another one? It looks very different depending on which sort of module you're talking about. I was involved. So I've been in as a PM. My experience is more. I've spent a lot of time working with data annotations and lowering the cost of data annotations to train the models. And this was pre AI. Like, before AI was understood the way it's understood today. It was more machine learning, and it was more, you build your model, you deploy it, you bring it to something like a platform like AWS SageMaker or something. So you essentially, companies at that point were building their own models. We were building our own models, gathering our own data, using that data to test, train, deploy those models, deploy that on real world scenarios. What are the inferences? Go back, fine tune the model. And so this is the cycle. And um, the the difference between those days, and a lot of that still exists, because as you're building custom models, that data may be available off the shelf, those models may be available off the shelf, versus in I was involved with a team that was building the models, gathering the data, doing it all in house, because of the very specific use case that we have. Quick cut to where we are today as an industry. It is, you have you have the chat gpts, you have the Anthropic Claudes, you have Llama from Facebook, you have all of the different models that have already been trained on existing text data for the most part. And of course, they're able to do image recognition and everything else. So the model piece of it, which is the hard part, has been solved for, or is on track to being solved and improved. So now somebody needed to know how models are built, or you needn't spend as much time building those models. It's off the shelf. Then you just bring your use case. You if it's you're trying to extract data from PDF documents, you bring your PDF documents, use the model, you get it. You get your, if it's analysis that you're trying to do, or if you're trying to set up a chatbot that needs to read through a couple of documents and answer questions based on it, you can do all of that today. What that means is two things. It means that, for if you're an engineer, And I know that's not your audience, but it's important for PMs to understand that perspective. If you're an engineer that's trying to get into the machine learning space, previously you needed to have a lot of specific technical domain knowledge, versus now you can shortcut a lot of that. And what's happened today in the industry is companies like, with GPT-4 and with Claude 3 and everything else that's coming out, the technical bar has actually come down for an engineer to get into the space. On the flip side, for a product manager, the technical bar has actually gone up, and so the two meet in the middle, in my opinion. And I could have a different perspective if you talk to me 6 months from now. Last year was a year of experimentation, and kind of what I've seen, what I think has happened is essentially that is now, as a product manager, and this is the part that I want to spend some time talking about. As a product manager, why has it become more technical? Is
Hmm.
now because you need to now be able to establish, is this model, is what I'm trying to solve, like, how is there even a path where I can use AI to solve the problem? The fundamental question is always the same. It is solving a problem. Does the Gen AI models that we have available, does it solve with this, or do I need to go do something else? And that's where it becomes the story. It becomes the case of, you have a hammer and everything looks like a nail situation. You don't want to get into that situation. You need to be very clear about what is the problem you're trying to solve, and then when you go sit with your engineering team, or when you're if you're involved with some of the online groups, there's a lot of open source models out there. You need to know what to do next. You need to know, what kind of conversations to have. You need to know what your inputs are. You need to be able to have an informed discussion with a technical person, which is why the PM bar for technical has actually gone up. And from an engineering point of view, you're able to get the deployments out faster. You're able to iterate. You're able to see your input. Okay, try a few things, find tune the model. Output doesn't work, back to square one. It's reduced some of those cycle times. Does that sort of add up?
Yes, uh, I do want to press you a little bit on that, on this particular area, Arjun. So, especially when we're um, if you're talking about models that are fairly mature, right? And
Mhm.
you've already had that opportunity over a period of time to build out the training data set, and put it into real world scenarios, test the efficacy, and so on. You're looking at, you're in a good space. Um, However, when we are talking about, say, newer parts of the problem that you're trying to solve, say, similar to how you mentioned that,
Yeah.
one product's design might be very different to the other. There might be new, say, for example, government decides to come in with a new policy where privacy regulation is
Yep.
huge, and therefore, your computer vision models need to ensure that it's not capturing any PII type of information.
Yep.
And so as a PM, you're trying to then work that into how you build and then train and deliver your product into market. um, how, how does, what does that process look like, right, in terms
Yep.
of, and I'm literally getting, maybe we are going into a little bit of a tactical situation here, but ultimately when you're building these sort of models, it's a team effort, right? There's the
Right.
PM, but then there's this entire ensemble of experts, from your data science to legal to business to, right, so aviation and FAA, and all of these groups were involved. So how do you navigate those type of situations?
Right.
And I guess the point you're trying to make is, for you to be able to effectively do it, you need to have more technical
Yes.
prowess. uh, but I am curious to try and understand, how do you navigate all these different stakeholder groups? What does that look like?
Yeah.
On a basis? Yeah.
This has been learning for me in the last, I'd say, about 2 years. That's the curve it's 100% what you talked about. It is the yes. While I did talk a little bit about, you need to become technically stronger. The part that I know, like, we talked a little bit about the models, and let's, like, sort of, how do you go about doing it. The part that I didn't talk about on the technical side, and I don't want to spend too much time about this because I do want to talk about the other stuff, is the system design piece. And if if you've ever interviewed with big tech, you'll typically go through some prep of how do you think of system design, having an understanding of if whether it's Azure, GCP, AWS, they all pretty much look the same from an infrastructure point of view. Some basics of what is storage, what is compute, what's distributed compute, and I think just having some of those basic concepts, and then working through a system design problem. How does Flipkart's ordering system work, or how does Blinkit's quick delivery work, right? And so like the back end of it, as a PM, you should be able to look at it and understand like how this works. So if you're a PM trying to break into the space, I would encourage you to spend a couple of weeks. There's a bunch of excellent online courses that can educate you on this, and fundamentally you start thinking, and that's how you build your technical muscle. Is being able to, you don't need to, like, I don't ever think that we would be in a position where a PM would sign off on a system design, but obviously having a voice at the table, right? You make sure that you understand what's being built, and I think that's the other piece. Fundamentally, that is still the case, and having a strong technical understanding is important. Now, back to the other pieces. The PM role with AI, and I think this is exactly where you're going, which is 100% spot on, is that we now need to think about more variables in the design process. The customer experience, or you kind of optimize experiences for the customer, and you try and reduce costs for the business. And when you think about your stakeholders, and when you think about the vectors across which you want to optimize for, you now
Hmm.
have more vectors, is what it is. And which is good, which is good product thinking. You now need, security is a P0, privacy is a P0, and by P0 I mean table stakes. And I remember I remember a time when I was in a product role when I did not think about security, because that was something that engineering thought about, and it was part of what they would, like, there's a checklist, we want to make sure that that happens before deployment, versus that's not the case anymore. I always think about it from a point of view that when I write out my when I write out my user epics, and I say, here's at a high level what I'm trying to do, kind of decompose that into user stories. I very very traditionally, keeping it simple. You want to think of this functionally, non-functionally. When you get to the non-functional piece, that's where you want to have a line item, or a swim lane for security and for privacy.
Hmm.
And that's the piece that can be pretty game changing in ways that you wouldn't imagine. It would, for example, like in exactly what you talked about. Same product looks different from a privacy angle in Europe versus the US versus Asia and versus Australia. It's going to dictate, your launch schedule. It's going to dictate your ability to add new features. Was in one place, was another, which back in the back end influences your tech stack. It depends on the design decisions you make. Do you want to centralize all your infrastructure in one country, but then you're going to run into deployment issues in other regions? Do you want to decentralize them? If you decentralize them, there's a trade-off. So that's why this is such an important consideration as a product person. Is you need to think about it. Now,
Right.
if you don't think about it, and I've been in projects where we haven't thought about it, we've had to go back and redo a lot of work, which is expensive. But you're always going to be in a situation where you're going to miss something. But the more you can front load your thinking around, this is exactly what we're building and why we're building it, and also you want to build it in a way that you can go back and make changes. So two-way door decisions versus one-way door decisions. You hard code something, you're in deep
Yep.
trouble if something
Yep.
changes. So that's how you want to think about it. And it's security and privacy specifically is And there are a lot of new startups that are coming up that address these problems exactly. And security looks different across different areas of the tech stack. It looks different to different users. There's operational security, there's engineering security, but a product person needs to have an understanding at a very high level of how does what kind of security are we talking about from a user perspective, from business perspective, from operations perspective, and write those requirements into the designs. So I'll
Right.
pause there if that makes sense.
Yeah. 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 That's that's helpful. So, Arjun, let's again let's shift gear into a different space. Um, what recommendations would you have for anyone, whether they are a PM or just someone who is curious about AI and really trying to incorporate that as part of their work, or in terms of how they design a product or service, right? Whichever sort of table they're sitting at, in terms of learning, uh, if you will, right? Like
Right.
there is so much that's happening.
Correct.
It is on a daily basis. There is news. There are executives who are moving from one space to the other. There's new technology. There's this. So how does one keep track of this? Do you have any practices that you would recommend to
Yeah.
say, hey, start here, maybe iterate on a daily basis? Like, what is your method, right?
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Um, I guess I would let me maybe see if I can so there are two answers depending on where you are in your career. I think I would have a slightly different answer for someone that's relatively new to product management versus somebody that's been in product management for a few years and looking to pivot. Let me address the first one. You're new to product management, or you're thinking about getting into product management. What do you do? One, I would recommend that you don't try to get into you don't box yourself into I'm getting into AI product management, because you'll soon find yourself not knowing what exactly you're doing. I would recommend you get into product management and treat AI as a means to an end. That's, and like, just mentally, that's how you want to think about this. If you're new, I would suggest that the best thing you can do for yourself is give yourself enough time. And this looks different. It could be 6 months in one case. It could be a year to 18 months in one case, to really understand the space, just to really understand the business. And I think about, and if you're a product manager coming into, let's say that you're working on a healthcare problem. My wife is in healthcare, and we have talked about some of the issues that she's facing at work, and how do we solve that. And I've sort of put on my product manager hat as somebody that's totally not in that space. How would I approach that? And it's the same fundamentals. There is a customer problem. They're trying to get to a certain end goal, so you want to start with the end in mind. And I would commit to spending a few, at least 6 months, maybe up to a year, with the user, with the customer. So you build a strong understanding of a certain domain, subdomain, and there's no substitute for that. Now, when you're doing that, like, be very very clear about the customer problem you're trying to solve. And I think that there's and I think the more time you do that, the clearer it gets. And then again, like, you want to do a bunch of there's a lot of content out there on product skills 101, between paid courses and between just stuff that's on YouTube. Like, I would try and educate yourself on how you work backwards from a customer problem to translate them into specific features that can be built. Now, how you build it, we'll get to it in a second, but at least at a fundamental level, you're able to understand that there are different facets to a problem and how you want to decompose. And I think that's step one. The actual build of it, now, depending on which depending on the environment you're in. If you're in a large tech company, or you have you're in an organization that has access to engineering and science resourcing, great. Like, sell the idea internally, try and build some collaborations, try and get the buy-in to get some engineering bandwidth to build some of these ideas and test it out. And I think you can go in that direction. If you're not that, if you're not an organization, I imagine a lot of us are not in that position. That's fine. Um, there are a lot of tools out there. There's several low code, no code platforms that let you build apps, that let you, define features, and you might still need, some engineering help, and that's also available through, freelance engineers that are always looking to do this kind of work. And so build out some of those networks, and start building some of these apps. And if I were interviewing somebody for an AI, let's say hypothetically I have a PM role on my team that needs AI skills. Here's exactly what I'm looking for. I'm looking for somebody that's defined a customer problem, decomposed it into features, worked with an engineering a team of some sort. Maybe they did it on their own, and they actually got an app out, or got a product out, that they took it back to their customers, 5 customers, 10 customers, I don't care, but got it back to a customer, and they used it, and the customers gave them some feedback, and then they cycled through once more. Maybe they tried a couple of different models. Then you that's where you start learning about models a little bit more. You understand, you start understanding the trade-offs. And that's again something, I think, if you're getting into the space as a PM, you want to understand what different models are for, where they specialize in. If you're trying to solve a use case where you want to provide an image and say, tell me what you see in this image, you look at a different model versus, you've got, let's say, you've got 3 news articles that you want to sort of summarize for you, and say, like, what's the key takeaways, of a certain policy, or what's the key takeaways of the union budget this year. There's those would look different. And so you'll start learning more about that. So really be able to, and there's just a handful of models in the industry right now that everyone's talking about. Get yourself familiar with that. And I think that's just that should take you about 6 to 8 months of just working through the weeds, and outside of your day job. You would be amazed at how much you would know. 80% of what somebody that, say, product manager in Netflix, for example, is doing this on a on a day-to-day basis. You would know a good chunk of what they already do. And just by kind of going because the fundamentals are basically the same. It's exactly what I described about. Sure, when you go into larger spaces, you want to think about CI/CD. There's more continuous deployment. You want to think about infrastructure. That's my next conversation. If you're already a PM, you're trying to pivot to a PM in AI roles. That's what that would look like. But the first part, keep it very simple. Get results. Spend some time, understand the basics. That's all. I think that's a good place to be in. Just kind of given where the industry is at right
Do you think rooting that understanding uh,
now.
in a framework, say very specific to products, or say even in a service life cycle or in a product life cycle, rooting it in that sort of a life cycle, right? So if we take a very basic framework, say like the product S curve, right, or
Yep.
say like product maturity model, and all the way from, say, zero to, say, plateau. Once the product has scaled, it has gone through its highs, and it is now at a plateau, and at some point it's going through a decline. Do you think that as you're learning these skills,
Right.
it might help to, say, even at the back of your mind, or as you're building your second brain, building your notes and so on, try and map that two
Yeah.
parts of the life cycle, like, because we've oftentimes we've seen, and as from personal experience, it always helps to know that at different stages of the life cycle, uh, what sort of AI techniques or AI related decisions need to be made. Do you think that having such an understanding would be helpful, maybe overall, would it be more helpful in the beginning or later side? Like,
Uh,
what's your take on that?
Let me. I think I am not sure. I think the industry and the space itself is too new to put ourselves into a framework at this point. That said, I think it's important to understand that you don't always need to be using AI to solve 0 to 1 problems. And I think if that's where you're going, that's a great sort of a line of thinking. In fact, a lot of the the challenges that we're seeing is really with a lot of the legacy systems, and AI can really help, build a lot. And for example, ERP systems. A lot of companies have large ERP systems that multiple users. Um, Clunky, super painful. You have you essentially have users hitting these databases for pretty
Yeah.
much standard queries, right? Nothing fancy or sexy about it. You're not trying to image classification. Very very vanilla work. Guess what, like great area for us to apply some of the models, right? And so now you don't need your users going and spending as much time clicking through a bunch of different services that aren't talking to each other. And so yes, 100%. And that's actually where I think the juice really is in the short term, is how do you take some of these models to read your existing databases, existing data sources, to be able to pull the data that you need. And you can think about this in in terms of healthcare, automotive, any industry you take about. Pretty much every business is sitting in on troves of data in some shape or form. And really, that's like, you need the data. You're not going to be able to draw conclusions, you're not going to be able to draw responses without some data pool to draw from. And if you see data, know that you can apply a model and get your questions answered. And I think, like, as a PM, that's the framework I would pivot to, against thinking of this more on a maturity scale, because we are so evolving. I would think of, as a PM, I would keep my eyes open on, and that's the other piece that I didn't talk about in the skill set, is developing a strong understanding of databases, and understanding a good understanding of structured and unstructured data, and being able to look at data sources and go, okay, there is something I can do here. The data sources could be in just tons and tons of PDF documents. It could be in completely unstructured log files, that there's some telemetry, there's some machine data that that's being thrown out, nobody's looking at it. That's another one. Or it's just maybe, in more sensitive industries like healthcare, there's limits, obviously, to what you can access and what you can't access, but data resides in some form in businesses. And or, hey, let's say you don't have access to any of this. There's tons and tons of public data available on government websites, non-profits, right? Like think tanks have made public data available. So that's where you want to make sure that you get that strong understanding of data. And you apply those models, and you're clear about the use case. It doesn't really matter if you're trying to solve an early stage problem or a later stage problem. Obviously, later stage, the impact is more. You're able to more definitively go after certain specific
Right.
one, versus it's more fun in the early stage ones.
Right. Right. It's great, Arjun. So, I want to talk about the culture, or the cultural aspect, a little bit,
Yeah.
right? And very specifically, we talked about a few very heavy topics, right? We spoke about last mile delivery and aviation, and technical product management and AI, and how do you really get into it. We went through all of these different topics. When it comes down to classic uh, execution day to day, culture plays a very very huge role. I'm curious to understand the role of meetings, and
Oh,
we touched upon this, when you mentioned the FAQs and how that's done, right? But just a hypothetical situation for you, right? um, uh, you know there's a local problem, right, in your municipality or government, say, for example, right? They've assembled an A team of different types of product managers who are in the room. You're one of those people who've been selected. So what do you think it is, from all of the experiences you've had,
right.
that will give you an unfair advantage over the others in the room? There might be others who might
Great
come
question.
with different kinds of experiences,
Right.
but what do you think it is that you would have in terms of an unfair advantage?
Yeah, I think just from the I guess the natural sort of inclination that I have in terms of I think the first unfair advantage I would have is as I think inherently I'm a person that just is curious, and I'm fairly confident that I can come into a new space and learn the sort of the bare bones pretty quickly. Now, even if I can't learn it quickly, I'll stick at it till I can learn it, and that's the other piece of it. So I think that's the first unfair advantage I have. That for me, what I seek out of my learning is, do I have enough clarity to act? And I don't act until I have sufficient clarity, not 100%. But there's a and I think that's the piece that I feel I would say that there is a piece of judgment that I think I've built over time, which lets me trade off three things: learn quickly, to understand enough, to act. And the other part of it is make sure that I have a shared understanding with the others in the room. And I think the third part is important. I can have a completely different point of view, understood something totally differently, and then I completely tangential and I break the trust that I have with my cohort. And so I think those three pieces, right, which is learn, build the trust, and then move, is I think those are three pieces that would, at least when I come into the space, that's the framework that I walk into it with. Step one, make sure that I really understand what we're talking about. Ask clarifying questions. Nothing's too dumb, stupid. Go back, read about it, educate myself. But there's a point at which there's diminishing returns. I don't want to become an eternal student of the subject. You
Yeah.
need to move. And this is a business, this isn't college, this is the real world. You don't want to get stuck in the rut of learning. You want to pull the trigger. Now, again, if I were an individual, just kind of at my desk trying out a few things, the third component doesn't matter. But to your point, you're bringing a group together. Shared understanding is very important. Shared understanding, alignment on what the end goal looks like, alignment on, or how fast we want to move. Um, there again, the unfair advantage I would bring, that I think I would have, is I would expect to walk into a group like that fully aware that we're all not going to be on the same page even a few cycles of discussions later. What do we do then? At that point, it's really, I think, I mean, if there's somebody else that's already been anointed as the leader, that's got the authority to make some decisions, great, I would align with the charter there. If not, I would be the one that's pushing the group to make sure that we get to an action plan quickly,
Sure.
right? And I know there's going to be some apples in that group that aren't on
Yeah.
board. I would have a
Yeah.
one-on-one conversation with them to get on board, or
Right.
talk about trade-offs.
Right.
That I think is an important piece of this move the group forward puzzle.
Have you, and final question here, Arjun. Have you been, and obviously you've been in many different meetings and in different sort of situations. Uh, you know, is there one meeting, right? And I really want to talk about this, right? Which is there one meeting that you've been part of, where you had a leader who presided over it, who sort of moderated it, and so who led it, where you felt that this has got to be the best meeting. Obviously,
Oh,
I'm expecting that some of
yeah,
the traits that you mentioned in your earlier response would be part of it, but I am curious to understand what that meeting felt like, because a lot of times we get into these situations where we spend a big part of our lives in in meetings. And I really like, for someone who's listening to this episode,
sure.
to walk away with that clarity of what you felt and what you thought was so great about it.
Yeah. Oh wow. Yes, I could talk all day long. So do look up Dave Clark. He was until recently the CEO of a company called Flexport. Long time, Amazonian, 23 some years. He quit Amazon, I think, in 2021 or 22 as the CEO of retail. I was in a couple of meetings with him when he was an SVP, and of course my and I think like that left a lasting impression on me. And I think obviously when you I take this name because this is somebody who's now a public figure, and you can look him up, read up about him, and I've sort of had an opportunity to work closely, be in a couple of meetings. Not I don't want to like overstate how close I did. I was like very very far removed, but like to your point about where did I learn, I learned a lot in the couple of times I've been in the same room. Of course, I've over the years obviously got a chance to work very closely with a lot of senior VP level executives, and you learn, and there've been some absolutely stellar VPs that have probably impacted me more on a more tactical way, or in a more tactical way. But I think when you see somebody operate at really high levels, somebody who's led an organization of literally a million people, you just think you just get to it's you get closer to the sun in some sense, right? And you see like how how they think. So I was I think this was probably again I was somewhere a couple of years in the company. I was still starting to have somewhat of an impact on my direct organization. Not nothing crazy. And we worked on I worked on a project. I was part of this team that essentially was putting together a proposal on how do we expand our it was a furniture delivery business, something like that. It was because it's one thing to deliver small packages, but it's another thing to deliver beds and sofa sets and all of that, and it's a completely different way. And Amazon had a small business, and we were thinking about that problem. And I was working with another director that was sort of primary. I mean, he was the lead on this, and had a big piece of that puzzle. And I remember being in that meeting, and I think the interesting thing there was, and some of this is again cultural, right? I should maybe give you some context on if you've been in similar meetings in other organizations, and I say, oh well, what you're saying doesn't add up. Yeah, some of it's cultural. So the way Amazon, like, I do want to spend 30 seconds talking about this. The way meetings are run in the place where I work is, especially uh, once every meeting with a senior audience, there has to be a document. I've never been in a meeting like when I say a document, it's in lieu of a presentation. Since we don't do since we don't do presentations, there is a document. Uh, a document is put together. There is a document owner that brings the collective voices. That document is a very well scrubbed document with we make sure there are no grammatical errors. To that extent, it's polished. And then people take 30 minutes to read a document. And we all sort of sit around the table, we read the document. Back then people used to print out documents and make notes on the side. Now of course you sort of comment on collaborative documents. We use Microsoft Word, Office 365. And so you sort of leave comments, but this is the days when we were still printing papers out. And everybody would read, and the senior leaders would sit in their offices, they would read 30 minutes. And there's this palpable excitement or fear when somebody walks in. This document that we had presented was, I think it was like 14, 15 pages or something like that. It was 6 pages of font and Calibri, very dense 6 pages with about 8, 9 pages of appendices, tables, a lot of addendum data, as you'd imagine. And I wasn't sure how the meeting would go. I thought it was a good idea, a good proposal. And 30 minutes later, this person walks into the meeting, and he's holding the document in his hand. And the page that he walks into the meeting is actually Appendix 3 or Appendix 4. He wants to start the conversation there, which I thought was crazy. I've never seen anybody do that. The way I've seen the meetings that I've been in typically is, we read the document. Even within the company, we read the document, we talk about overall comments. How do we feel about what's going on? Let's make sure we're fundamentally in agreement or disagreement. I've been in meetings where people say this is absolutely not what I was expecting, this is a waste of my time, let's go out, let's come back in 2 weeks time and make sure we talk about let's realign. So then we don't need to get into details. Okay, I've seen those. I've seen the other side, which is good. I like the idea overall, let's get into specifics. Now somebody who's that senior up now walks in. I've never seen somebody, and some people read appendices, most people don't read the appendices. But here was somebody that wanted to start the 1 hour discussion with the table on appendix 3. If it's in the appendix, you probably put in
Yeah.
there because you thought it wasn't that important. But
Yeah.
that's the point, right? I think, and it was amazing, and I had put that table together, and that's why I was even more concerned about. I'm going to be, there were 25 people in the room. Uh, Thankfully it was a good discussion, and but I think my uber point is this: the ability to be able, and this is true as a product person, this is especially true. You want to be able to go through a lot of data, or deal with a lot that's thrown at you in general, not just data, right? Like situations. As a manager, I deal with escalations on a day-to-day basis. There's some customer problems. You really want to be, you're always going to be in a situation where you have time to do three things and there are 10 things that need your attention. It's knowing which three things to focus on in a short period of time. And I think that's what senior leaders do really well. Is over time you get good at identifying those three, and even in those three, you cannot drop the ball on those three. and
Yeah.
and I think being okay with, you're not going to be able, you'll never be in a position where you just don't drop the ball across the unrealistic expectation, and you're not stretching yourself far enough if that's the situation you're in. But I think just knowing what's non-negotiable and then spending 80% of your time diving into it, that's to me the most effective way to use meetings. And that's why I love meetings. That's why because if I'm coming into a meeting, if there is a meeting convened, my expectation is that there's one person in this room that's going to drive this, that knows exactly what we're all going to focus on, and keeps us sort of grounded around those two three things. We can spend the last 5 minutes talking about numbers 4 to 10, acknowledging the existence, what do we want to do. That's not what we want to spend time with. That's to me what I took away from the meeting, and that's kind of stayed with me, and try to do better in each one of those.
Awesome. Excellent. So, Arjun, I think we are at the end of our discussion.
Already.
Before we wrap up, if there, if people want to reach out to you or connect with you, is there, is there a forum or some sort of social media handle that you prefer to?
Sure. My LinkedIn's the best way to connect with me. I'm Arjun Sampath Kumar, Arjun, Sampath Kumar. You'll see a profile photo of me that looks a little different from. It's an old photo of me, but you'll see me. I'm a senior manager of product and engineering at Amazon Prime Air. Feel free to DM me, connect with me. Happy to like chat up, and I'm very curious to see what else is going on. I think one of the downsides of being in a very niche space is that I think I tend to, on a day-to-day basis, over focus on one thing. So anytime that I can step back and look at problems that folks are working on outside of my space, is always a great learning experience that lets me go back into my world and like apply some of those learnings. And so always open to do that. If you're in the Bay Area, you're in Seattle, hit me up. Happy to catch up in person. But yes, otherwise, looking forward to connecting.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time, Arjun. Appreciate the conversation.
Was great. Was great talking to you, Anil. I think what you're doing here is really cool. I think we need more voices from the community talking about their experiences, so that I think folks that are trying to break into the space, grow into the space, can really connect the dots. I think personal anecdotes are very powerful, and I think you're helping move this forward in the right direction. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Arjun.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. So
Thanks.
we'll wrap this up here. I'll